That was a nice trip.
Okay,
Yes.
Jeff and Kim, are we good on sound? People, all right. We were struggling just a little bit with sound. I am excited to be in the book of Exodus. And I was excited to hear John Mark preach from the book of Exodus today. We are in the story of Moses. And last week, I kind of went through the end of the book of Genesis and talked about Joseph, Jacob, Joseph, etc., and how Joseph had been sold into slavery by his brothers. He had been favored by his father and his mother and had been sold into slavery to Potiphar's house and ended up being accused of rape and went into prison and interpreted several people's dreams. And ultimately that led him to Pharaoh's house, where he interpreted some dreams. And he interpreted those dreams as 7 years of plenty, of bounty, and 7 years of sacrifice, of famine that would overtake Egypt and all the land of Canaan. And so while he's there, he ends up rising to the level of prime minister. He is the second in command. We'll come to Moshe, who ends up being second or in line for the throne today as well. So Joseph ends up having an interaction with his brothers who come from the land of Canaan to get wheat. And ultimately that moves all of Jacob's family, because of the famine, into a land called Goshen, which is in Egypt. And so they prosper there. And so we flash forward from the beginning of the book of Exodus, which we started last week. 430 years is where we are today. 430 years later, the people of Israel, according to the promise that God made Abraham, have expanded into a multitude of people, estimated to be between 2 million and 3 million people. And that's where we are today. So there's a new Pharaoh that comes on the scene, as we studied last week. And this says the Pharaoh didn't know Joseph. And what it means is he didn't want to know. He was actually there was a change in the 18th dynasty of Egypt, where the local Egyptians overthrew a group of people called the Hyksos people. And so these people, these Egyptians and this new Pharaoh looked out and saw these Israelites from the land of Goshen and said, there's too many and too mighty for us. We have to deal shrewdly with them. And that was plan A. The rulers in Egypt were going to deal shrewdly by them by working them into the ground. And it was their hope that is working them into the ground, that they would limit their numbers, that they would become unhealthy. But exactly the opposite happened. The Bible says the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. So that was plan A. Plan B was that they went to the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah, and everybody remember the other name that we're going to name my daughter-in-law? Puah. That's awesome. Puah Russelina. Right. So Puah Russelina, by the way, is scheduled to be here this Tuesday. For those of you who weren't here, I was vetoed on that name. But by the way, I tried to get her to deliver this week before I head to Iraq today. And she's like, what am I supposed to do? And I said, well, would you try jumping jacks? And she looked at me the way Carolyn does. You idiot. You're a total idiot. Okay, I'm sorry. Back to the Bible. And so Puah and Shiphrah, who are the midwives, they basically instruct all of their lower midwives, just don't do this. The midwives, the Pharaoh says, what we're going to do is we'll have the midwives, if it's a boy, kill the boy when they're on the birthing stool. And so they don't do that. They don't cooperate in plan B. And the Pharaoh says, what are you doing? And their answer was, well, these Hebrews aren't like the Egyptians. They're very vigorous. And they have the baby before we get there. And so he starts with the rulers, dealing shrewdly. He goes to the midwives. And then lastly, he goes to all the people of Egypt and says, okay, here's what we're going to do. If you see an Egyptian male baby, throw it in the Nile. And so Moses, writing the book of Exodus, talks about his own birth and says when his mother, Jochebed, saw that he was a beautiful baby, that she couldn't throw him in. And so she kept him for 3 months. And ultimately, it was just time. She had to do something. And so she made a basket lined with pitch. And the word basket is the exact same word that we find in the book of Genesis for Noah, which is an ark. And so Noah was saved in an ark as the Pharaoh's daughter comes to the Nile to bathe. They see the basket, she sends an attendant over, and lo and behold, Moses' sister, Miriam, was standing there watching. They draw out the baby, and the Pharaoh's daughter sees that he's beautiful and that he's a Hebrew baby, and she decides to take it as her own. And so Miriam goes up and said, would you like me to find a Hebrew who can nurse it for you? And she happens to know somebody. And so she goes to Jochebed, Moses' mother, and the Pharaoh's daughter says, it would be great if you will nurse, I'll also pay you wages. And so she's got a double win. And so Moses was a child when we left the lesson last week. 40 years later is where we pick up today. Again, the book of Exodus is a story of deliverance. Moses is a deliverer, an emancipator. This story is about the sovereignty of God, how God is moving in his own ways and his own times to accomplish his own purposes. And it's about law. We'll come into sacrifice and the law, and we'll understand that sin has to be paid for by blood. And all of this is an ultimate foreshadowing of Christ. Now, Moses was the most prepared person in the world. The book of Acts says, and Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. Josephus, the Jewish historian, said that he was a powerful, great general. Not only was he instructed in all these things. And so Moses grew up learning the Egyptians were far advanced in chemistry and warfare and history and all of these things. And so he was trained unlike anybody else in the world. And this Pharaoh did not have a son. Josephus says that Moses was in line to be the next Pharaoh, and he rejected all that. So let's kick off.
One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, seeing no one. He struck down the Egyptian and he hid him in the sand. And when he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? And he answered, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely this thing is known. And when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well.
One day, 40 years from when he had been born, we learn that in the book of Acts, he is out on his own. And notice two times it says his people. Moses knew who he was. Moses knew that he was not an Egyptian. He knew who his people were. In Hebrews 11:24 through 26, we see by faith, Moses, when he was grown up, 40 years old, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. So Hebrews, by the way, I study commentaries, and you have all different views. Almost every issue you go through, there'll be 5 or 6 different views of scripture and what happens. But ultimately, the best commentary on the Bible is what? The Bible. Hebrews and Acts tell us exactly what's going on. And as we come up to this, we don't really know what's going on with Moses, but Hebrews says he's making a decision to reject what he has, to reject the crown, and to look at these people. And it says he looked on their burdens. And that actually means, the literal translation is, he sees with emotion what they're going through. So these are my people, and he's welled up with emotion. He knows who he is. But he also knows, although what he's about to do is admirable, it's deplorable, it's murder. And we know that it's murder because nobody does those two things. Nobody comes up and looks this way and looks that way to see if anybody's watching. And then when they actually take somebody out, they don't bury him in the sand so that there's not even a proper burial. He knows what he is doing is exactly wrong. And he is being a prince and a judge in this case. These weren't two guys that were just fighting. There was one guy that was in the wrong. I mean, you could look at this and say there's just two people arguing, but no, he comes up to the man that's in the wrong and he says, why in the world do you strike your companion? And he answers and says, who made you a prince and judge over us? I've talked about Joseph being a Christ type. Moses is a Christ type. They're asking him exactly the role that Christ is in our lives. Christ is supposed to be a prince. A prince is something worthy of being subject to, and a judge to tell you and determine what's right and wrong. Moses is a Christ type, and he's coming up in here, and we learn in Acts, again, the commentary of Acts, this is Stephen. And Stephen is actually using analogies all the way through his sermon to point to the fact that Israel rejects Christ. And so in Acts 7:23, you can go down, Acts 7:23, when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them was being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptians. This was his motive. Verse 25. He supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them the salvation by his hand, but they didn't understand. So what he's saying is that just like Christ came to you, Israel, Moses is coming to Israel to take care of the oppressed. And all the oppressed do is say, Jesus, who made you prince? Who made you judge over us? And that is a foreshadowing of the Christ that will come. Interesting how ultimately Moses is used. Moses here is clearly a murderer, but God used David as a murderer. God used Moses as a murderer. God used Paul, who I believe was a murderer, at least consenting to people's death. He did dramatic things with people who had done dramatic wrongs. And so he realizes now that it's not his time, because down in verse 14 at the end, he says, surely this thing is known and I have to get out of here. I have to flee. And so Moses fled from the Pharaoh and he stayed in the land of Midian and he sat down by a well. If we go down to the map, you'll see the land of Midian. And so Egypt is over just below the Mediterranean, and he goes all the way down to Midian, and I'll talk about who the Midianites are in the coming verses. Catherine, can you go ahead?
Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled their troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them, and he watered their flock. And when they came home to their father Reuel, he said, how is it that you have come home so soon today? And they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hands of the shepherds, and he even drew water for us and watered the flock. And he said to his daughters, then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. And she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob, and God saw the people of Israel, and God knew.
The priest of Midian. Anybody remember the story from Genesis of Melchizedek, who was a priest, and no one knows where he came from and no one knows where he was, but it's believed that he was a priest of the Most High God. It's the same thing here. So Midian is an interesting person. Midian was actually the 4th son of Abraham, and he became his son after Sarah had died. So Abraham married after Sarah has died at 127 years old and has a child. So I've told Carolyn that I am not taking the vaccine because it affects your fertility. And if I'll wait 127 years, but after that, if I need to start over, then I'll go ahead and start over. So I'm joking. So anyway, so the Midianites are cousins. They're Semitic cousins of the Jews. And so he's a priest of the Most High God. He's a worshiper of God. He has three names that we go through here. He is known by priest of Midian. He's also known, as we see here, by Reuel. And then we'll also see him by Jethro. Now, the name Reuel means friend of God. That was probably his proper name. And so Jethro means excellent, which may have been a title. So he is a priest, a friend of God, and most excellent. And we see that the shepherds come and drive these 7 girls off the water. And as I'm watching this, I watch in nature when I'm deer hunting, and bucks will come after the does around corn or feed or wherever, and they'll chase the does off. They'll duck their big horns and they chase the does off. And it just strikes me how in nature, let me tell you, if you have a daughter, little Pua, by the way, I'm going to tell her, stay away from bucks that are first in line to take care of themselves. You know, look for somebody like Moses that's going to take care of you. Reuel and or his name Jethro, he knows that. He's like, you're in a desert, 7 women. There's not a lot of guys around here, and you find one gentleman and you leave him? Anybody remember Fred Sanford? Yeah. You big dummy. I love that. I've got a dummy for a son. Well, that's what Reuel is saying. Wow, are you nuts? Go get that guy. He's perfect for us. And so they go off, and it says that he is content to dwell with Reuel. He knows he doesn't have a home. He knows that this is not his place, and he's actually hurting. And we know that because he calls his son Gershom, which means stranger. For he had said, I had been a sojourner in a foreign land. He aches because his people are not there. He knows this is not where he's supposed to be. This is not his land. He's a stranger. And during those many days, 40 years, the king of Egypt dies, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. They're crying. Anybody remember, I taught actually this section of scripture in September of 2020. We had a prayer series, and we talked about holy ground and approaching God. And there was a term that is used for when we place human attributes, or the Bible places human attributes on God. Anybody remember what that is? I'll buy you lunch if you do. It's called an anthropomorphism. You just right on the tip. You almost had it, I could tell. You were like, anthro something. Yeah, anthropomorphism. So we have 4 anthropomorphisms that come up in these scriptures. In verse 24, so the prayers come up, and in verse 24, God heard. Verse 24 still, God remembered. And then in verse 25, God saw. And then God knew. God is all-knowing. He is all-present. When I taught this lesson, when we get to the burning bush, and I'm going to bet I've taught burning bush multiple times, I came to the conclusion this week that I've taught it wrongly. What's the proper English? Wrong or wrongly?
You messed up.
Yeah. I've changed my interpretation. You know, I was right. I've just got a better interpretation. How's that? And so to say that God saw or God remembered really lowers God. He is all powerful. He knows exactly. He is omniscient. He knows what's going on. It's just not his time. But this is what is, yeah, go ahead, Sean.
The 3 people you mentioned, they all seem to follow the same pattern. You know, when Paul, after he got saved, he went away, and then David went through that period where he's down in southern Israel with the Philistines, and now this, it's like,
Yeah, so Sean, for those of you in Zoom world, that's a great point. I actually heard a sermon this week where it said that God calls his workers to have a backside of the desert degree. And they point out the fact that Paul went off into desert, and then David goes into, and Getty into desert, and then same thing with here. They go off and God begins to work on them. Because God was doing, that's a great point. So God was doing several things with Moses that we'll see. When he comes in as the prince and the deliverer, he is empowered. He has confidence. He's in line for the throne. Josephus says he's a great general. And I think God looks at him and says, yeah, we're going to break you. We're going to bring you down just a little bit. You're going to the desert. And I think that's where he's working on him right now. But that's a great point. This is way too many verses. So I'm going to read Exodus 3:1 through 6, and we'll pause. And then we'll move on, and Catherine will read the rest of the section. Now, Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, which means excellent, which is Reuel, and the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. That's also called Mount Sinai, which we learn about later on, a very significant place in the Bible. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of fire out of the midst of the bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, and it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned, meaning consumed. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called out of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. Why did he say it twice? I don't know. I have got no idea, but he did. And there was enough, and he said, here I am. And then he said, do not come near. This is God talking. Then he said, do not come near. Take off your sandals, your feet, for the place you're standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Moses hid his face, and he was afraid to look at God. He's now 80. He's now 80 years old. He's grown. Everything up through halfway through chapter 2 was him being a baby. Then he grows up and flees. And now he is 80 years old, and he's being called by God after 40 years in the desert. After having been in line for the throne, what is he doing? He's a shepherd, and he doesn't even have his own sheep. He's tending the sheep of someone else. He is as low as he can be. Can we go down to the map of Mount Horeb? There's two maps. No, up, the other way down. Yeah, there you go. Down, up. Okay, so this is the traditional location down at the Sinai Peninsula. Can you go down one more? Here is the other location. So we don't really know which of these two locations that he is in. The Bible kind of contradicts itself. But the traditional site, if you go up, is right there. And I think most people believe it's there, other than it's on the other side of the peninsula of Midian, in the land of Midian. And so the Lord appears to him in a flame of fire out of a brush and a bush. And so most scholars believe that this bush, almost like a tumbleweed, is made of thorns, and it's called an acacia bush, because the acacia bush has at times been used as a symbol for Israel. And thorns, if you remember in the book of Genesis, God says that he's going to curse the earth with what? Thorns and thistles. And Jesus, when they put the crown of thorns on his head, they actually believe it was an acacia bush. And so it's symbolizing Israel, it's symbolizing a curse. Some commentators think this fire symbolizes Egypt, just ever consuming, not consuming, but ever burning this acacia bush. And so he comes to him in the midst of that, and he speaks to him, and God calls out in an audible voice, Moses, Moses. It's just an ordinary day. right? He doesn't know, he doesn't get up that morning. How many of you have had those days where you just get up, you have no idea what's going to happen, and then you have a head-on collision, like my wife did several months ago, and your world just changes? Well, that's what this is. It's an ordinary day, and he sees this, and there are people who believe that there may have been bushes that had self-combustion that burned all the time. And so that wouldn't have been a new sign for him, other than this thing just doesn't stop burning. It just burns and burns and burns. And Hebrews talks about how God speaks to us. It says, long ago at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. So the Bible tells us in Hebrews that God, back in these days, was an audible voice saying, Moses, Moses, Moses. And what he's telling us now is that the Bible is the way he speaks to us. He is speaking to us in this Bible. What I've always taught when he told him to take off his sandals was that it was the presence of God. But that's wrong answer, because why? You're always in the presence of God. Something about this encounter was holy. And that's what the real answer is. It's where you meet God, that's the holy ground, where you're seeking him, where he communicates with you in some way and you're listening to him. That's holy ground. That's what this is. And so I just think I've taught it the wrong way. And God is making a special point about his holiness when he says, don't come near me. Don't come near me. Take your sandals off. You need to recognize that I am holy. And so, okay, now let's jump into 7.
Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. And I know their suffering, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of God, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, I will be with you. And this is the sign that shall be for you, that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain.
Okay. What are those first things? Seen, heard, know, come down? And no, you're out. We got to get a pitch hitter in here. Okay. Anthropomorphisms. Notice that last one in verse 8. He says, I have come down, and then go down to verse 10. I will send you. What does that mean? I will come down. So is it God doing it? I will send you. Or is it Moses doing it? Yes, that's exactly the answer. God wants to work through people. He calls you to do something. Every one of us have a calling. And he wants to work through you, but he wants to accomplish his purposes through you. And that is what he's doing. Now, his plans don't make sense to people. Who would have, if you had to go back and say, okay, I'm Don, I'm going to choose the apostles for Jesus. He wouldn't choose those. Would you choose those 12? Who would choose those people? No one. Who would choose a murderer Pharisee to be the great deliverer of the Gentiles through the message of Christ? Who would do that? Who would choose a shepherd that's not even shepherding his own people? Well, God is working through him. And Moses comes up with his first excuse. Keep in mind, those guys said, hey, who are you? Who are you to be prince? Who are you to be judge over us? So it sunk in 40 years. He's now 80. He's like, hey, who am I? You know, Ben Franklin said, "He who is good at making excuses is seldom good at anything else." And so Moses is actually going to make about 5 excuses to God. And he has no self-confidence. It's clear in this thing. He's like, who am I? I'm not qualified. I'm a shepherd. Who am I to do this? And God answers him, but I will be with you. But I will be with you. And what he's saying is, look, it's not important who you are. Moses clearly lacked self-confidence. I think when he came up to those guys that were fighting and one was in the wrong, I'm going to bet he was supremely confident of his position. And in 40 years of managing someone else's sheep, he's totally lost it. And God has him exactly where he wants him. He knows that he's got the confidence. He knows that he's got the training. Who else would have been more trained? Who had been a general in the Egyptian army, who was in line for the throne, and also has the humbling experience of being a shepherd. He's the perfect place, even the perfect person, even though it's nonsensical to us. And it takes us back to the book of Philippians in 4 that we just finished, chapter 4, where right at the end, we learn that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And so that's what he's saying. It's not important. I'll be with you. It's not important who you are. And he tells him that you're going to serve God. You're going to serve God on this mountain again. 3 months after they exit, God comes to Moses and he says, okay, I want you to come up on the mountain. I want you to consecrate all these people for 3 days to clean themselves, to put on their best clothes. I want you to have the priest ready. The priest will come up to a certain point on the mountain. The people will come to a certain point on the mountain, and I'll meet you on the top with Aaron, and I will deliver the word of God to you. And the Bible talks about it wasn't a burning bush when that happened. There was fire and there was smoke and the earth was quaking and there was thunder. And these people were like, oh my gracious. And several more things are going to happen on Mount Sinai. All right, you're doing great.
Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your father has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and Jacob has appeared to me saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt, and I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt and to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And then they will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now please let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. And after he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty, but each woman shall ask of her neighbor, and any woman who lives in her house, for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and on your daughters. So you shall plunder the Egyptians.
This is so awesome. He makes a second excuse. So the first is, who am I? And then secondly, I'm unknowledgeable. I don't even know what your name is. And I remember early on hearing, how many follow Popeye the Sailor Man?
Oh, that's what I thought.
I know. This is so Popeye-ish. And that sounds disrespectful, but when you read it, that's exactly, I am what I am. That's all, and that's all that I am. And I can't quit saying that. But it was a perfect response to Moses saying, who am I? Who am I? And God saying, I am. You remember the study of John, the 7 great I ams, and the best one of all is John 8:56 down at the very bottom. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He's in front of these Pharisees. He saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to him, you're not even 50 years old. And have you seen Abraham? And Jesus said, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. And so their response was to pick up stones to throw at him, because you know what? They knew what he was saying. These Pharisees pick up stones because they know Jesus is saying, I am. And so this I am, I mean, it means that I am ever powerful. I am all knowing. It's just the sum total. But if that name doesn't work for you, then you let them know that I am the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. You don't need excuses, because I am. He comes in again. If they don't know me, just know that I am Israel's God. Again, down in verse 16, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. And I promise you, verse 17, that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt. Isn't it amazing? God already knows what's going to happen. That's a key part of this. He tells people this is going to happen. There is a predetermined sovereign purpose. It's all laid out. And that's why we should have the peace that surpasses all understanding. And so he tells him, go on a 3-day journey. And there's all kinds of theories about what this 3-day journey that they request. I believe that they were actually sincere, that God was saying, okay, we'll give him a chance. Now, I know it's not going to work because we're about to plunder the Egyptians, but we'll give him a 3-day chance for you to go off and worship for 3 days. But he also knows Pharaoh is not going to accommodate that request. Ultimately, I will give this people favor in verse 21 by the side of the Egyptians. And when you go, ultimately, you're not going to go empty. You're going to have gold jewelry, you're going to have for clothing, and you'll put it on your sons and daughters, and the sons and daughters who have been prisoners, slaves for 430 years will be elevated, and the Egyptians will be humbled. The whole story here, the takeaway, is how God, even to somebody that has no self-confidence, enables and empowers him. And he's working all the way through this story to give him the tools to accomplish God's purposes, and empowering him to accomplish his purposes as well. And so it's a wonderful, wonderful story of sovereignty and how God is working in the lives of Israel and in the lives of us.